I spent years inside the intelligence system learning a basic truth that never changes. Large failures do not arrive without warning. They announce themselves quietly through anomalies, whistleblowers, irregular reporting patterns, and institutional discomfort. What happened in Minnesota did not begin with a sudden revelation of massive fraud. It unfolded the way intelligence failures always do, gradually, visibly, and inconveniently. Early reporting flagged irregularities in COVID-era relief programs and Medicaid-linked funding streams. Investigators raised concerns about child care centers that existed on paper but not in reality, billing the state for services that could not be verified. Journalists and local watchdogs noticed the same thing. Intelligence analysts are trained to notice. The numbers did not match the observable world. When inputs and outputs diverge at scale, something is broken. The first failure was not criminal, it was analytical. Systems designed to detect abuse treated these discrepancies as administrative noise rather than threat indicators. In intelligence terms, this is what happens when collection exists but prioritization fails. Data was available, complaints were logged, patterns were visible, but no one with authority wanted to elevate the assessment. Fraud on this scale carries political consequences. And once political consequences enter the equation, analysis becomes distorted. Instead of asking whether fraud was occurring, institutions asked whether acknowledging it would cause damage. That is not intelligence work. That is narrative management. What followed was a familiar sequence. Whistleblowers were sidelined or dismissed. Oversight mechanisms slowed. Enforcement agencies deferred action pending further review. Each delay allowed losses to compound. In intelligence assessments, delay is itself a decision. When leadership chooses not to act on early indicators, it implicitly accepts risk. Here, the accepted risk was taxpayer money on a staggering scale. By the time the issue could no longer be contained, losses were already measured in the hundreds of millions, then billions. That progression tells me the system was not blind. It was willfully nearsighted. The most dangerous phrase in intelligence is "this will resolve itself." Fraud does not self-correct. It metastasizes. The warning signs in Minnesota were not subtle, and they were not isolated. They were consistent, repeated, and corroborated by multiple sources, but they collided with a political environment that treated scrutiny as hostility and oversight as stigma. Once that mindset takes hold, institutions stop protecting the public interest and start protecting themselves. The hard lesson from this first phase is simple. Intelligence failure does not begin with missing information. It begins when leaders decide that seeing clearly is more dangerous than not seeing at all. Once institutions decide that acknowledging a problem threatens their standing, protection of narrative replaces protection of reality. I have seen this pattern repeatedly in foreign intelligence failures, and the same mechanics applied here. The moment fraud became politically inconvenient, it was reframed not as an operational risk, but as a messaging hazard. Oversight was no longer about stopping losses, it was about controlling perception. In intelligence terms, this is when assessment becomes advocacy. Facts are no longer evaluated for accuracy, but for usefulness. Evidence is filtered through the question no analyst should ever ask, who does this hurt? In Minnesota, scrutiny of fraud intersected with identity politics, electoral calculations, and reputational fear. That intersection proved paralyzing. Concerns raised by investigators and reporters were treated as potential sources of social conflict rather than signals of criminal activity. This is a classic institutional trap. When enforcement agencies are conditioned to see certain lines of inquiry as politically radioactive, self-censorship follows. No memo needs to be written. The message is absorbed culturally. Analysts learn what not to elevate. Managers learn which reports to slow walk. Leaders learn which questions not to ask in briefings. I recognize this instinct because it mirrors how intelligence failures abroad are manufactured. Threat reporting that contradicts preferred narratives is labeled incomplete, contextually sensitive, or premature. The language sounds cautious, but the effect is suppression. In Minnesota's case, fraud was allowed to continue because confronting it risked accusations, backlash, and political cost. The institution's survival instincts overrode its fiduciary duty. Once that happens, fraud ceases to be an anomaly and becomes a protected condition. Narrative protection also distorts accountability timelines. Leaders can claim ignorance longer than reality permits because formal acknowledgement is delayed. By the time action becomes unavoidable, responsibility is diffuse. Everyone can say they inherited the problem. That diffusion is not accidental. It is how bureaucracies shield themselves. From an intelligence perspective, this is equivalent to failing to brief decision makers until an adversary has already acted. The outcome is predictable, damage becomes irreversible. What makes this failure particularly instructive is that it did not require sophisticated deception. No foreign adversary was manipulating data. The deception was internal. Institutions convinced themselves that silence was safer than truth. That is a far more corrosive failure mode than external espionage. When a system prioritizes narrative harmony over factual accuracy, it cannot correct itself. It can only collapse under accumulated contradiction. The hard lesson here is unforgiving. Once narrative protection becomes policy, intelligence becomes fiction, oversight becomes theater, and accountability becomes performative. The cost is always paid later, and it is always higher than confronting the truth early. Institutional blindness is not the absence of sight. It is the deliberate narrowing of vision to avoid uncomfortable conclusions. I watched this dynamic unfold repeatedly during my time in intelligence, and the same mechanics were present here. Agencies responsible for safeguarding public funds did not lack authority or information. They lacked permission, not formal permission, but cultural permission to act decisively. Once narrative protection took hold, silence became the safest institutional posture. Silence, however, is not neutral. It carries a cost, and in this case, that cost was measured in staggering financial loss and evaporating public trust. Oversight mechanisms exist for a reason. Audits, compliance checks, investigative referrals, and interagency coordination are designed to surface abuse early. When those mechanisms slow simultaneously, it is not coincidence, it is convergence. Each agency waits for another to move first. Each defers responsibility upward. Each documents concern without triggering action. From an intelligence standpoint, this is what we call systemic diffusion. No single failure point, but a network of small abdications that collectively produce catastrophe. Fraud did not succeed because controls failed technically. It succeeded because controls failed behaviorally. Silence was justified through process. Reviews were pending. Data needed reconciliation. Jurisdiction was unclear. These explanations are familiar to anyone who has watched intelligence warnings die in committee. Procedure becomes a shield against accountability. Meanwhile, fraudulent actors interpret inaction correctly. They understand that enforcement is hesitant. They scale operations. Losses compound. In intelligence work, adversaries test boundaries constantly. When no response follows an incursion, escalation is rational. The same logic applies here. Fraud expanded because it encountered no resistance. The political consequences of breaking silence further reinforced inaction. Officials understood that acknowledging massive fraud would implicate leadership failures, invite scrutiny of alliances, and destabilize careers. So silence persisted until external exposure forced the issue. That timing matters. When accountability is reactive rather than proactive, credibility collapses. The public does not measure failure solely by loss totals. It measures failure by how long leaders knew and did nothing. What I find most damaging is not the money lost, but the precedent set. When institutions demonstrate that silence is rewarded longer than honesty, future warnings will be quieter. Analysts will self-censor. Inspectors will hesitate. Whistleblowers will think twice. This is how governance decays. It does not explode, it erodes. The hard lesson from this phase is unavoidable. Institutional blindness is not an accident. It is a choice reinforced by incentives. When silence costs less than truth, systems will choose silence until the price becomes unbearable. fraud becomes most dangerous when acknowledging it threatens ambitions larger than the fraud itself. I have seen this repeatedly in foreign policy failures, where inconvenient intelligence is buried because it complicates strategy, undermines alliances, or disrupts political momentum. The same logic operated here. Once leadership trajectories, national visibility, and party positioning became entangled with governance, fraud ceased to be treated as a solvable problem and instead became a liability to be managed. At that point, the question was no longer how to stop the losses, but how to avoid destabilizing broader objectives. From an intelligence perspective, this is a decisive inflection point. When leaders calculate that exposure will do more damage than concealment, delay becomes strategy. Fraud is tolerated not because it is unseen, but because it is deemed strategically inconvenient. Every additional month of silence buys political time at the expense of institutional integrity. This is how tactical corruption metastasizes into strategic failure. The longer acknowledgement is deferred, the more severe the eventual reckoning becomes. What makes this phase particularly corrosive is that evidence continues to accumulate. Investigative reporting expands, arrests occur, internal memos circulate, the signal grows stronger, not weaker. Yet public posture remains unchanged. In intelligence assessments, this divergence between private knowledge and public narrative is a red flag. It indicates leadership is no longer responding to reality, but attempting to outlast it. That approach never works. Reality does not tire. It compounds. Strategic inconvenience also warps enforcement priorities. Agencies tasked with action become risk-averse. Prosecutorial timelines stretch. Administrative remedies replace decisive intervention. Each half measure is justified as prudence, but the underlying motive is preservation. In the meantime, the fraud ecosystem adapts. Actors learn which behaviors attract attention and which do not. They adjust structures, rotate fronts, and exploit the hesitation. This is indistinguishable from how adversarial networks respond to weak counterintelligence pressure. Eventually, the cost of continued denial exceeds the cost of exposure. That moment is not chosen by leadership. It is imposed by scale. When losses reach levels that can no longer be rationalized, resignation and retreat replace deflection. Careers end not because fraud occurred, but because the response revealed a deeper failure of judgment. In intelligence terms, this is not a tactical defeat. It is a strategic collapse of credibility. The hard lesson is one leaders rarely accept. Treating fraud as strategically inconvenient guarantees strategic damage. Protecting ambition over accountability does not preserve power. It concentrates failure until it becomes fatal. Credibility is not lost in a single announcement. It erodes quietly, then disappears suddenly. From an intelligence standpoint, domestic credibility is as critical as foreign deterrence, because once the public stops believing that institutions act in good faith, governance itself becomes unstable. What unfolded here followed that exact pattern. Citizens did not simply learn that massive fraud had occurred. They learned that warnings were visible, oversight existed, and action was delayed until exposure made denial impossible. That sequence matters more than the headline number. People tolerate mistakes. They do not tolerate concealment. I have watched credibility collapse overseas when governments insisted conditions were improving while evidence showed the opposite. The reaction at home was no different. When leadership retreats only after losses reach extraordinary scale, trust does not recover through explanation. It collapses through recognition. The public recognizes that accountability was not delayed because information was missing, but because confronting it was inconvenient. Once that realization sets in, every subsequent statement is discounted. Assurances sound hollow. Investigations appear performative. Reform promises are received with skepticism rather than relief. The timing of retreat is itself an intelligence signal. Resignations and withdrawals framed as personal or strategic choices are understood by the public as admissions without confession. No amount of rhetoric can obscure the sequence of events. Warnings emerged, action lagged, exposure forced response. That pattern teaches citizens a dangerous lesson. Institutions act only when compelled, not when obligated. From a governance perspective, that is corrosive. From an intelligence perspective, it is destabilizing. Credibility loss also spreads laterally. Agencies not directly responsible are implicated by association. Oversight bodies lose authority. Media credibility is questioned for not pressing harder earlier. Even legitimate enforcement actions are viewed through a lens of suspicion. This is how one failure metastasizes into systemic distrust. In intelligence work, we understand that once confidence in assessment collapses, decision makers either ignore warnings or overreact to them. Both outcomes are harmful. What makes this phase irreversible is that credibility cannot be restored through messaging. It is restored only through demonstrated accountability over time. That process is slow and it requires acknowledging failure without hedging. Institutions rarely do this voluntarily. They prefer narrative repair. But narrative repair without structural correction only deepens cynicism. The hard lesson is stark. Domestic credibility is a finite resource. Once spent defending silence and delay, it cannot be reclaimed by explanation. It can only be rebuilt through actions that accept responsibility without excuse. What distinguishes the most damaging intelligence failures is not secrecy, but visibility. The information is there, the indicators are present, and the consequences are foreseeable. The failure occurs because institutions choose not to integrate what they already know. That is why this case belongs in the same analytical category as some of the most consequential misjudgments in modern American policy. Data existed, warnings circulated, patterns were identified, yet action lagged because interpretation was subordinated to comfort. In intelligence analysis, we are trained to separate collection from assessment. Collection answers the question of what is happening. Assessment answers the harder question of what it means. Here, collection did not fail. Reports of fraudulent billing, non-existent services, and program abuse were available through audits, investigative journalism, and law enforcement activity. The failure lay in assessment and escalation. Leadership treated each data point as isolated rather than cumulative. That analytical fragmentation is a known failure mode. It allows decision makers to dismiss individual warnings while missing the systemic threat. I have seen this abroad when early insurgent activity is classified as criminality rather than organized resistance, or when adversary troop movements are described as exercises rather than preparation. The language sounds reasonable until it is proven catastrophically wrong. In Minnesota, fraud was framed as manageable, localized, or exaggerated. That framing persisted long after evidence contradicted it. Once assessment becomes politicized, corrective feedback loops break. Institutions lose the ability to self-correct. The most telling indicator of intelligence failure in plain sight is retrospective surprise. Leaders express shock at outcomes that were entirely predictable. That surprise is not genuine, it is performative. Analysts knew the trajectory. Investigators saw the scale increasing. The only unknown was when exposure would force action. When officials act stunned by consequences they had time to prevent, it signals that intelligence was ignored, not absent. This kind of failure is particularly dangerous because it teaches the wrong lesson. Institutions may conclude they need better data, more tools, or additional authorities. In reality, they needed analytical courage. More information would not have changed outcomes if interpretation remained constrained by narrative protection. Intelligence systems do not fail because they lack facts. They fail because leaders reject inconvenient conclusions. The hard lesson here is unforgiving. Intelligence failure in plain sight is not a technical error, it is a leadership failure. When leaders choose comfort over clarity, they guarantee that consequences will arrive without mitigation. Every major institutional failure eventually converges on the same conclusion, and it is the one leaders resist most fiercely. The collapse does not originate with criminals, foreign adversaries, or flawed systems. It originates with choices made by people who decide that preserving narrative coherence is more important than confronting analytical truth. I have seen this dynamic destroy intelligence credibility abroad. and I am watching it hollow institutions from within. What happened here is not an anomaly, it is a case study. The defining feature of this failure is not the scale of fraud, but the refusal to treat it as an intelligence problem early enough to matter. Intelligence, at its core, is about anticipating consequences and acting before damage becomes irreversible. Once institutions redefine that mission as protecting reputations, careers, or political trajectories, intelligence becomes decorative. It exists, but it no longer functions. Analysts produce reports that go nowhere. Investigators collect evidence that sits idle. Oversight becomes ritual rather than restraint. The damage from this shift is cumulative. Leaders who learn that ignoring warnings carries fewer consequences than acknowledging them will repeat the behavior. Subordinates who learn that speaking plainly invites risk will soften their assessments. Whistleblowers who see retaliation or indifference will stay silent next time. Over time, institutions lose the capacity for honest self-evaluation. At that point, collapse is not a possibility. It is a process already underway. What ends political careers is rarely the initial failure, it is the exposure of judgment. Voters and citizens understand that fraud can occur in complex systems. What they will not accept is the revelation that leaders saw warning signs, deferred action, and acted only when concealment failed. That realization reframes everything that came before it. Successes are re-examined, statements are reinterpreted. Credibility evaporates not because of one scandal, but because of the pattern it reveals. The lesson that no one wants to learn is brutally simple. Intelligence corruption does not require falsifying data. It only requires deciding which truths are safe to acknowledge. Once institutions make that decision, they begin constructing a reality that cannot withstand contact with facts. When that constructed reality collapses, it takes careers, trust, and legitimacy with it. From an intelligence realist perspective, this outcome was not sudden. It was inevitable. Systems that punish clarity and reward silence always arrive at the same destination. The only variable is how much damage they allow before admitting what they already knew. That is how intelligence becomes fiction. That is how strategic narratives collapse. And that is how credibility, once lost, does not return.